And political analyst Marco Vicenzino joins me now in the studio tonight. A very good evening to you, Marco. Russia and Egypt still insisting tonight that it's sheer speculation that this was some kind of explosive device. What does David Cameron know that they don't?
David Cameron, he has his priorities. First and foremost is the security of British citizens. You have over 1 million that every year go to el-Sheikh, holidaymakers. Secondly, you have domestic public opinion that he needs to take care of that. Earlier this year, you may recall that in Tunisia, there was a massive attack on the beaches in Tunisia, that it was British holidaymakers, Germans. The last thing the Prime Minister wants is a repeat of something like that happening to British holidaymakers. And the fact is that he may have intelligence. I think if some would say he jumped the gun, but I think for him to go this far, I think he actually may have had some actionable intelligence pointing to a clear and present danger for British citizens. So he wanted to come forward. Had there been another attack involving British citizens, it would have been found out that he had that information but did nothing about it. It would have cost him his political career.
We can only speculate about the different conversations that must have been had a bit earlier on the phone with David Cameron and Vladimir Putin, David Cameron and al-Sisi. The whole problem here, I suppose, is a huge diplomatic hurdle to be overcome. But is it possible that the Russians, because of purely domestic issues, could be wanting it not to be ISIS?
If you look at priorities, you look at the Prime Minister's priorities. We mentioned first about domestic public opinion and also the fact of the security of British citizens. You have two other priorities here. The second one is obviously the case of Egypt, which is the fact is that it was the same day, the timing was terrible, and the fact that the same day that President Sisi arrived in the UK, he gets off the plane and he finds out about the ceasing of the flights to Sharm el-Sheikh.
Sure.
Egypt is an indispensable ally for Britain and for the West itself, particularly if you look at a turbulent region right now in war. So it remains a critical ally. And this type of attack, if it's a bomb, it's a huge blow to the economy of Egypt because tourism is a big hard currency earner. And the last thing is that the Russian they want is to be able to do damage to an ally like Egypt. Russia, less difficult to handle because the fact is that Russia is already involved in Syria, and what Putin can do is if it is an ISIS attack, Putin can easily spin it to intensify his military intervention in Syria.
That's right. So I'm being very cynical here, and I suppose that many commentators might be in circumstances like this. But Russia and Egypt, therefore, both have vested interest in it perhaps not being ISIS, and they're doing everything they can to perhaps thwart that impression just now. But there may well become a time over the next 24 hours or next 48 hours when incontrovertible evidence comes out.
Putin insisted that there needed to be pending the outcome of the investigation, no one should really make comments. That was his point. And that this type of investigation can take possibly months to conclude. So what they're trying to, yes, I agree. What they would try to do is try to delay and extend as much as possible while the public psyche at home and abroad tends to forget about it. So if you find out that at some point down the road, 6-7 months, it was an ISIS attack, the impact will be less. So you try to stretch it out as much as possible from their perspective.
This is kind of realpolitik, I suppose. Also, if Russia does finally accept that it is the case that this so-called ISIS affiliate in the Sinai did do this, put some kind of bomb or explosive device on that aircraft, what would the result of that be as far as their retaliation would be concerned? Wouldn't we see them bombing the ISIS headquarters in Raqqa and all the rest of it?
Logical intensification. Until now, when September 30th, when the Russian military intervention began in Syria, they said it was on the pretext largely of fighting extremism. And the majority of their targets have been non-jihadist, non-radical opponents of the Assad regime. This is going to have something like this would give them the pretext. They would have to intensify and increase their attacks on ISIS targets, which in some way would present an opportunity with greater collaboration and cooperation with the Americans in Syria, who are specifically focused on ISIS targets and not the Assad regime.
Marco, stay with me just for a bit. Let's see how this is all playing out in America, and we can now join our Washington reporter, Shernay Williams. A very good afternoon to you there, Shernay. Anything being said in Washington regarding what's been going on here in London?
Well, people are just very uneasy here because, I mean, if ISIS planted a bomb on this plane, it would take the conflict in Syria to a whole new level, as you guys have mentioned. It would be a global threat now, they would be. And it would mean that the efforts the U.S. has led against ISIS in Iraq and Syria just have not been working. But ISIS involvement still has not been confirmed, and so intelligence officials have not ruled it out as well. But Army Colonel Steve Warren, he's a spokesman for the Pentagon, and he's saying that as of right now, U.S. policy toward ISIS has not changed. Obama's plan still includes just a couple dozen troops in Syria, so we are really just in a holding pattern here.
Shirley, stay with us for a minute. I'll come back to you. Marco here in the studio. Again, being cynical, could this whole dreadful incident about the downing of the plane actually play into American hands in that it would force possibly Russia into really striking the positions of IS, whether it be in Sinai or in Raqqa or anywhere else?
They would have to, not just for their own domestic public opinion, but in terms of international public opinion. Remember, the initial offensive, the initial military intervention was largely predicated on the premise of going after the terrorist, after ISIS. And after a bombing of this nature, they would have to logically increase their targeting of ISIS positions, primarily in the east of Syria. So yes, I mean, and that's what I spoke about, potentially present an opportunity for greater collaboration between the Americans and the Russians in terms of targeting ISIS. The Americans, their specific mission in Syria is to target ISIS and not Assad's regime.
Okay, Marco, thank you very much indeed.